your skin microbiome. This basically is everything that is in and on your skin that isn't your own cells. So from fungus to bacteria. We're namely going to talk about bacteria here, as we're going to be discussing P. acne, which is the bacteria that's implemented in acne development. So to get you a little bit situated here with the graphs, because they don't directly call out the species P. acne, they call out the phylum and the family. As we can see that this is the phylum and this is the family that P. acne is in, and here we also have the phylum which P. acne is in. So using those as general references for the presence of P. acne, we can see that the back, sides of the nostrils, behind the ears, upper chest, and between the eyebrows, and not the buttocks or the palms of the hand or armpits, because there barely is any bacteria in those areas. Whereas here, it makes up almost half of the total bacterial count in the area. So when we cross-reference this with the skin type, let's say oily, we can see that there's a direct correlation between the oiliness of the skin and the proliferation or presence of P. acne, or likely presence of P. acne, although other studies have deduced this more precisely than what I'm doing or showing you now. So this basically can give you a good understanding of why maybe you don't get pimples on your butt very often compared to your face. And this is a good general rule for the majority of people. Now I have seen people end up with acne on their forearms, which is kind of obscure location for acne, but not necessarily one that is without possibility, as we see that there is some correlation with the area, along with certain habits. A lot of people actually end up wiping, because they don't want to touch their face with their fingers, they end up wiping their face with their forearm, and over time there could be an ability for the forearm skin to become inoculated with the P. acne bacteria. However, because of certain resistances and sensitivities that P. acne has, it's not likely to make full-blown colonization there, and that's why you have a great reduction in the potential or percentage of people who actually have it on their forearm. So this is basically a graph that's both supposed to make you more familiar with where P. acne is as far as where its lineage comes from, and also its presence on the skin, and basically how it interacts with or is present with other bacteria in the skin. So these are all the factors that can influence your skin. So a lot of people look for, what is the next miracle product that I can take? What's the next supplement that I can take, or topical treatment? The reality is that those are just a couple of the things that you can do for your skin. This is a graph, although poorly made by me, is one that basically helps you move through this program. We talked about how environment can impact your skin and the things that you can do, hopefully, to change that. What we haven't talked about is exercise, sleep, diet, toxins, and stress. Now, by the end of this program, I will hopefully to have instilled proof that by either direct or indirect means that you're going to that these factors influence your skin. So, although a topical treatment can do wonders for your skin and may even cure certain people, a program like this is going to help you understand everything that you can do to change your skin. And if this doesn't work, basically, I'm not going to say nothing will, but you're entirely reliant on the next generation of drug, basically. Right now, there's a lot of things that you can do to change your skin, let's say. Um, and the thing is that this is where also outliers come from. So some people may say that exercise was 50% of the reason why they have had acne, and sleep was 20% of the reason, and diet was 10, and stress was another 10, or you get the idea. But basically, each person's contributing factors is going to differ depending upon the individual. Someone may eat like crap, but they sleep great. Um, Someone may be very stressed out, but they have the right exercise protocol. And so by working with this system and understanding all the factors and how these factors influence your skin, you're going to be able to basically pinpoint what could be the reason for your skin, rather than say, oh yeah, totally, that makes sense, like a lot of these infomercials trying to convince you on, is that they oh yeah, my acne totally is because of a lack of benzoyl peroxide. It could be other things, and it needs to be looked at in much more grander detail than simply asking for the next supplement, chemical, or laser peel or exfoliant. And hopefully this will give you the added insurance that you need to make the move. I know a lot of people, basically the reason why they haven't made certain changes is because they're not going to radically change their diet if they don't know that that's going to impact their skin. If I don't know that I need to remove ice cream from my diet in order to have clear skin, I'm still going to eat ice cream. Unless it's proven right there in front of my face, I'm still going to eat ice cream. And so hopefully I've given you enough evidence to give you a proof, basically, and actionable advice so that you can change your skin. There are differences in people who have versus do not have acne as far as their skin barrier is concerned. So one of the dominant factors is a 59% roughly increase in total sebum. So what is changing within the sebum? Well, there's a 34% increase in squalene. There's a 16% decrease actually in waxy esters. There's a reduced fatty acids of 53%, and there is a 19% increase in triglycerides, along with lauric acid, which is decreased. So there's dramatic changes that have occurred. Most notably, squalene has increased considerably. So when you also consider that squalene is one of the dominant or differences within any within the sebaceous gland, anyways, is seasonal affective acne. So this is a question that was asked by a study whether or not seasons influenced acne. So they were just basically taking a survey, and the participants were asked this question. And so they responded with seasons affected about 50% of the participants' acne, or was said to. Of that 50%, 80% summer was the aggravating factor. Sweating and increased sebum and humidity are likely the cause of this increase in aggravation. With winter, 64% said that their skin was not affected, and 11% said that their skin was influenced by or worsened by winter. So this may be because of dehydration or just certain activities that are done during the winter that are not done during the summer, such as maybe football. Now, another aspect, because they didn't control for that sort of variable. So another influence here, though, is, again, this is just a separate study that does show that sebum production is increased within winter opposed to any other season. Now, you may think that, well, winter is also, you're getting a lot of sunlight, and you're also, which would increase your vitamin D production, and also you're getting a lot of UV radiation, which some have presumed to actually have a positive effect on the skin. As we can see here, though, that the statistics support loosely that summer is going to be an aggravating factor for the majority of people. Now, there's other potentials such as spring and pollen production and its increase on inflammation and congestion and a number of other things that could have a potential impact on acne. But as a totality, this is what we have for seasonal effects of acne, and I wish we had more evidence, but unfortunately this is what we have. And hopefully with future and your pressure we can get better data. So we've just discussed the layers of the skin and the acid mantle and the hydration mechanisms and the skin barrier, basically. But we haven't really given a good view to what dry skin looks like. That's an important factor when talking about acne, because many individuals who have acne from at least a moderate to severe state have epidermal thinning, and that basically doesn't allow them to hold as much moisturizing capacity. So because they have less natural moisturizing factor, because they have less lipids, because they have less water, more things can readily remove that from their skin. And until their skin basically becomes healthy and can lock in those components and grow to its proper thickness, it's going to continue to have this proneness. So it's important to make this distinction, though, that it's not psoriasis. This is a sort of different pathology that's has been developed. It has some similarities, but certainly this has distinct qualities. One of which is that showers seem to be, like a hot shower seems to be the more predominant environmental cause. You can certainly attribute detergents to this issue as well, along with other medications such as isotretinoin. But I think one example that sort of highlights this importance is that, let's say you go into a shower and you wash your face with soap, which I don't recommend you doing because of the removal of the acid mantle and such, and you remove this layer and you step out of the shower. You may at first think, oh, my skin's fully hydrated, which in fact it is. It does have a lot of hydration in it currently, but the unfortunate thing is that there's nothing holding that hydration in, because you've just removed the lipids and you've also removed the natural moisturizing factor. So because of which, as soon as you step out, go to school on this wintry day, let's say, by the time first period comes around, you're going to have very dry skin, and your friends are going to comment on that. So by not using detergents, reducing the temperature on the water and the time that your face is exposed to the water, and using a moisturizer, you're going to greatly lessen the intensity of this issue, along with combining certain therapies that we're going to talk about in the treatment section of this. So that should give you pretty good gist of what exactly goes on. I mean, remember, this is corneodesmosomes attached together that are moving together simultaneously from the skin, and that's why you get the clumping. There's one more thing to note, actually, and that's that there's enzymes that again break down these certain connection points, and some of them operate through hydrolytic mechanisms. So when you have a lot of water on the surface of the skin, basically these enzymatic proteins go into overdrive, and they can help to tear down the skin and, in a sense, resurface it, but too much too quickly, and then that's why we have this condition here. So with the proper treatments and protocol that we've just described, you're going to be able to have hopeful great reductions, if not clearance, of this issue. Cellular communication. This is could be a very important part of acne. Basically, it's how these potentially your skin cells, along with your endocrine system, which we'll talk about why it's named that in a second, communicates with your skin. So as we can see, there's the endocrine system, which is largely suggested to be your hormone system. They're kind of used analogous to one another. And then there's the pancreas system, and this is when basically cell A goes to cell B. And that's different from the endocrine system because it doesn't necessarily travel through the bloodstream as endocrine system does. So we can suggest that something in the skin may be different from something in the blood because of the interaction between the pancreas system. Then there's also the autocrine system. Basically, a cell sends out a signal, goes out, and self-stimulates a receptor. This is actually pretty important for cancer because it can actually try and make itself survive when it would otherwise not be stimulated by the endocrine system. And then there's also one of the final ones, which is basically junctionary secretion, or junctionary system, if I'm saying that right. And that's basically one cell that's attached to another cell, or one junction which is attached to another junction stimulates a receptor. That's probably a bit more evident here, where we talked about before junction connections within the keratinocytes, and so this is basically an example of how they're communicating. Gap junction was one of the examples that I believe I used for this. Now, these are all four very similar examples of the same thing, but hopefully by looking them over you'll get a better understanding of what kind of communication goes on within the body, and therefore hopefully come up with new and exciting ways to treat acne. So now that we understand our communication system within ourselves, we need to understand bacteria's. The basics of it is that you have a signal from bacteria 1 and a signal from bacteria 2, and those two communicate through something called quorum sensing, which is just a term for this communication. But it's important to look up that this is actually something that is being suggested to be used for therapies for acne by interfering with this quorum sensing, we may be able to interfere with how the bacteria grow and what they do, as we'll talk about in a second. Bacteria are very tricky in the fact that they can actually have something called the virulent factor. They can express this depending upon the quorum sensing, which I discussed earlier. And this virulent factor can be something like a super antigen, and it can be basically something that can disrupt our cells or cause them to result in damage. It's the virulent, it's the violent element of the bacteria. And that may also be on the skin, or I should say on the cell, so the bacteria cell, that is, or it may actually be being excreted. As you can see, there's many different things going on in this very sort of comical styled graph, but there's adhesion molecules, which are basically helping these bacteria bind to each other and bind to other cells, and there's the biofilm that they're producing in order to also for long distance adherence to other bacteria in their surrounding area. And there's signaling molecules to again get that sense of how many other like bacteria are around it, so it can see if whether or not it should take on the host or express its virulent factor. And there's also phaging, which is basically these phages are moving from a genetic material from one bacteria to another, and these phages, bacteriophages, are very important for producing bacterial resistance, because when this phage passes, let's say you wipe out 99.9% of the bacteria, well, that 1% of the bacteria, not only can that 1% divide, but it can also give its genetic information that may be encoded for why it was resistant to other bacteria that just made it out of there by chance. And so that passing on can result in more damage and also persistence of the condition, especially because when things become sort of out of control, inflamed, it also seems to be an opportunity for bacteria to do this sort of transfer. Amongst the chaos, they're less targeted. It seems like they can grow more. I mean, that's a very that's generalized sort of information. It's not necessarily very specific, but that seems to be the case at least within something like bowel inflammation. That seems to be something that can result, and that it can be in humans or in cattle as well. P. acne exacerbation and virulence. So this discusses what makes acne grow and what also causes it to be damaging, and how is it damaging, I should say. One of them is a growth paradigm. So basically, as acne grows more and more, the body starts to recognize it as an issue, suggesting that, oh wow, this is really growing more so than it should be. Let's go ahead and take it out. And this is also sort of like a quorum sensing of our own body, and the fact that it recognizes and destroys or inflames the area to destroy the bacteria. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is the role that insulin, DHT, and glucocorticoids could have on the expression of virulent factors from P. acne. So what I'm suggesting here is that insulin and DHT could potentially increase the development and number of P. acne directly, meaning that you have receptors of IGF-1 or androgen receptors on the P. acne themselves, and therefore not only is it stimulating and causing issues with the keratinocytes, but the the P. acne themselves actually become stimulated through these hormones. Another is foods. So lipids can have a big role in causing P. acne to grow, and via lipase secretions. So its ability to secrete lipase basically allows it to break down triglycerides and then therefore be able to digest it. Now, there's other sort of chemoattractant enzymes that are also spit out by P. acne that help, again, attract the immune system and cause inflammation of the area. There's also biofilm. So when let's say you have plaque on your teeth, right? That plaque is because the bacteria on your teeth are growing and sort of secreting this glycolic polymer that helps to keep it defended against anything that's going to interfere with its growth or cause it damage. And it's basically a little microenvironment. Now the same thing is going on with P. acne, and is that it's secreting these glycopolymers and allowing the keratinocytes to become trapped in that and potentially clogging the pore through these glycolytic polymers. There's heat shock proteins which can stimulate the immune system and infiltrate it. There's also adhesion proteins that are created that can selectively increase or activate the alternative complement system. And there's the antibodies, which are secreted by P. acne. And these are really important because they are linked to the severity of acne. So depending upon if you actually have an immune response or an antibody to these antigens that are being secreted by they're actually super antigens that are being secreted by P. acne, then you may have a increase in the severity of your acne. Some people talk about vaccines for acne, but this may not necessarily be the case because it is increasing your immune response to the P. acne when that may not necessarily be what you want to do, because this inflammation is actually what's causing a lot of issues. It's a balancing act with the immune system, and it's about making it smarter, not necessarily stronger, because we don't want to get autoimmune disease of our skin, which is basically what's occurring. You're having a immune response to a bacteria that you really shouldn't have an immune response to. You're allergic, in this case with the antibodies, to a bacteria that you should not be allergic to. It's basically like always having something on your skin that you're allergic to, or always eating it, and that's one of the things that can increase the severity, if you can imagine that. This is also increases the classic complement pathway. There's phage therapy, which I talked about. There's natural or intrinsic glucocorticoid production by P. acne, which can suppress the immune system in certain instances and allow it to sort of dodge it, yet still allow the growth aspect to occur. It may impact your appetite, meaning that there's discussion of candida affecting how you eat, basically, and you're wanting sugar through neuropeptide stimulation. The same case could be that for acne, in that it is trying to get sugar to get that insulin production so it can grow. So one of the reasons why it might be so hard to change your diet is because, at least at some level, it's hard to distinguish how impactful it is. The acne bacteria and this inflammation of your skin is sort of trying to continue forth and be on your skin, which is, for me, I think very impactful when you're trying to think about changing. If you know that something's trying to stop you from changing, you can actually feel like, okay, I'm going to fight this. If you know that you're being suppressed, basically, you're more engaged in trying to change yourself than rather saying, well, I'm just stuck in my ways. You're not necessarily stuck in your ways. You could be getting manipulated by the P. acne bacteria. Again, that's I'm sure that's circumstantial and also very. It's not to the extent I think a lot of people would probably take that, but it definitely has an impact on your mind. So once the bacteria P. acne was known as Corneobacteria, and it was renowned for its ability to modulate the innate immune system. And I think that's really important because if you try to look at P. acne, all you're going to see is discussions of it around acne, but when you look at its commensal capacity from past literature with this species indication, you're going to be able to uncover a lot of unique things that P. acne can do that may help us, and which is a very interesting way of looking at P. acne rather than it being pathogenic, is just simply a result of what the stressors and all the other environmental factors in our genetics have predisposed, and epigenetics has predisposed us to have. Now, the other thing that's really important about P. acne is when you want to think about what allows it to survive is that all of the Corneobacteria have to have biotin in order to survive, and basically break down fats. So a lot of these medications that are let's say hair growth stimulants and such that basically say take 6,000 biotins and 6,000% of your daily value of biotin, you may be coaxing the acne bacteria to grow. We'll go a little bit into what exactly the mechanisms of growth are. P. acne metabolism. Basically, this is how P. acne grows and proliferates. The first thing we need to understand about P. acne metabolism that is it is anaerobic, meaning that it grows in an oxygen-free environment, and that oxygen actually inhibits, if not destroys, the bacterial growth. Now, or the bacteria itself. Lipids, as we likely know from previous illustrations of where acne grows in the body via the sort of oily sites, are quintessential to the development and growth of P. acne. It primarily uses free fatty acids and uses lipase to break down something like a triglyceride into these free fatty acids. The other thing it can do is that it can also use a glycerol, which is the backbone of triglycerides. It can't use that greatly, but it may be a pro versus con when you're trying to look for a medication. It's difficult to really solicit exactly how much that matters. I think generally that glycerol is going to be beneficial to your face, despite its glycerol's ability to metabolize, P. acne's ability to metabolize glycerol. The other thing, like I've said, is that P. acne needs biotin to grow. And now remember, biotin is an enzyme that aids in lipid metabolism. Now the other thing is that it grows in cultured mediums about 30 to 37 degrees Celsius, which is around 100 degrees. This is important because we want to understand maybe the conditions at which it grows best in, and how maybe we can modify those conditions in order to and also understand these conditions in order to stifle the growth of P. acne beyond an excessive state or a pathogenic state, a virulent state. So one of these important things to understand how bacteria grow is understand the mediums at which we grow them in a lab. So there's modified reinforced Clostridia agar broth mediums, and there's also tryptic ace soy agar broth and defibrinated sheep's blood. So if we can figure out which characteristics are the reason for why we use these agars or these mediums for bacterial growth, because they're designed for the best bacterial growth, because you can get more cell cultures, we'll be able to figure out, okay, what makes these the best, and then how can we again adjust the skin in order to make it a more harsh environment for P. acne and a better environment for our skin. So this is an example of how the immune system reacts when given certain antigen levels. At this lower antigen level or lower P. acne bacterial level, there is a priming of antigen-presenting cells and naive T cells, which is basically immune cells that don't really know what to do yet, begin to mature and change into certain subsets of the T cells that are basically become effector cells, or cells that actually are capable of acting with some specificity. When you have a higher level of the antigens, you sort of sidestep some of this, and the time can basically be reduced, by which it ends up maturing. And then you have the immune activity. Bacterial resistance and antibiotic mechanisms. This discusses basically how bacteria become immune to antibiotics and how antibiotics work. We talked about phages from a perspective of phage therapy, but we should have discussed actually that phages are how bacteria end up moving their own genome, their own DNA from one part, or from one cell, or from one bacteria, I should say, to another. And this is basically how bacteria can transfer resistance. So if one bacteria is doing really well, and it sees other bacteria, not doing so hot, it's going, oh, I got the thing that makes everything us survive. So it'll start to transfer or move out those phages, these little pockets of DNA, and then those little pockets of DNA can then be integrated into the DNA of other bacteria, and then you can create the sort of protein structure that'll allow for the resistance. So how does an antibiotic work? And it works by many ways, one of which we talked about again, which is weak acid building up inside the cell, tearing through the membrane and causing osmotic stress and cell bursts. Another one is inhibiting certain aspects of the gene, which may be related to its own proliferation. So if you basically say find a gene that allows the bacteria to grow, inhibit that gene, or methylate that gene, then it will basically not be able to get red, and then the bacteria won't be able to grow or divide. Another one is basically ask the cell to go into hyper overdrive and eat itself. And basically you're leaking out a lot of enzymes into the cytoplasm that would end up destroying all the proteins that's within the cell, which the bacteria would typically use to maybe disintegrate, let's say, another fatty acids or something like that, that are exterior from the body or from the cell. Now, the other one is that it basically inhibits its metabolism. So, again, instead of turning the metabolism to overdrive, if you will, you can sort of basically allow or starve the bacteria by blocking its lipase action. You don't allow the P. acne, in this case, to eat, and therefore dies. So how can a resistance develop? One could be that enzymes are upregulated that degrade the chemical, and others are forms of proteins that rapidly remove the chemical, so it ends up taking it in and spits it right back out, and so it doesn't even have a chance to have an action. Again, going to the biofilms, this reduces how much can actually interact with the cell itself, and basically it acts as a barrier between the the bacteria and the chemical additives that are used, or I should say the antibiotics that are used to try and destroy the bacteria. And again, this can actually help enable bacterial resistance, because when you're only getting little bits of antibiotic through, it has a chance to begin to say, hey, this is hurting me, let's start to form an adaptation to the stressor. And another one is it basically can, again, it actually helps if you leach out the enzymes that are used to degrade the chemical before they even get to yourself, as it speaking from the perspective of the bacteria. They're now degraded because they were stuck in the biofilm. So those are a couple different ways that bacterial resistance end up developing. So here are some fun facts about the bacteria P. acne. One is that they're visible underneath black light. So this is actually one of the ways that we identify P. acne and its presence, because there's fluorescence, I should say, because of the activity of porophorines, and because of the way bacteria, or this chemical, I should say, interacts with the black light, it ends up changing the color. And this is actually a protective mechanism used by bacteria. Because of the UV radiation coming in, it starts to upregulate these phorines, I'm going to call them, and then it showcases them on your skin. There's the gold standard for identification is the 167 sRNA gene. So basically, that's a definitive understanding that that's the gene that makes P. acne, supposedly P. acne. It makes it unique. There are at least 3 different types of P. acne, and some may be bad and some may be good. And what I mean by that is, if you have some of or more of type 1, then you're less likely to have acne than, so let's say, type 3. That's not necessarily definitive, but there is research going in that direction, and there's some that's been fairly positive, actually. P. acne is a gram-positive bacteria, meaning, well, we won't get into that, but basically, under certain conditions, it is dyed a certain color, versus others, which are gram-negative, which don't get dyed a certain color. Now, skin bacteria, the skin density, how much is typically on the skin, is about either, let's say here, about 10 to the 2 or 10 to the 5. This is one with 2 zeros on it. This is, which is 100, and this is one with 5 zeros on it. Excuse me, 10 to the 5 or 10 to the 6 per centimeter squared. So one little cube, one. So basically, I would maybe, if I was going to put it on here, like that big of a cube has over 100 bacteria on it. Probably more like 1,000 to 10,000 bacteria on it, and sort of in it, if you will. Now, it can survive about 8 months in ideal conditions. So when it's probably on your skin and you're not doing anything to it, it's sitting on your skin for about 8 months. So that one bacteria is able to hang out and cause damage or not cause damage in certain cases for about 8 months. Very in an oxidized environment, it can actually survive for several hours. So potentially on your pillow, it can survive until maybe you rest your head back on it. Again, though, it doesn't necessarily have to be alive in order to cause damage, because the bacterial ring, the membrane that's on the P. acne bacteria, is what's being recognized by your troll-like receptors, which I believe we've talked about. Hormones. So this is a really big aspect of skin. But the thing I want to point out is it's what's in the skin, not what's in the blood. So it doesn't necessarily directly matter if you have high levels of testosterone, unless the skin has a capacity or ability to interact with that testosterone. So this is what we call active or inactive. Another term for it is free or bound. Now, what is this testosterone free or bound from? Well, it's free or bound from a regulative sex hormone called sex hormone binding globulin. This basically renders testosterone inert, meaning it can't interact with the androgen receptor and can't stimulate lipid synthesis or anything to do with hyperkeratinization. So, as we see, in order for testosterone, let's say someone has a high level of testosterone in their bloodstream, someone's like, well, he has a high level of testosterone, why doesn't he have acne? Well, he may have a high level of bound testosterone. Another aspect is that you also actually have a conversion factor. See, the thing about hormones is that they all come from places, and they can also evolve into different things. And in some cases, this can be better for acne, and other cases, this can be worse. So 5-alpha reductase, there's two types, 1 and 2, can actually increase testosterone's activity, I should say, by converting it to dihydrotestosterone. So testosterone comes through, it has to be free, so the 5-alpha reductase can interact with it. Once it's interacting with it, then it converts it to dihydrotestosterone, and this creates a super testosterone that's 25 times more powerful, if you will, at stimulating the androgen receptor than testosterone by itself. Now, the other thing, though, is that you can have as much dihydrotestosterone as you want, but if you don't have cellular sensitivity and organ sensitivity, if your skin cells don't have an androgen receptor, it's not going to do anything. So if, let's say, maybe an individual has a lower level of androgen receptors within their sebaceous glands, but has a high level of dihydrotestosterone, maybe the two cancels out and he doesn't have any more increased acne at all. So, and then there's another aspect, which is the degradation. So you have something in your blood, it's interacting with things, and eventually it goes away. But in the case of, let's say, dihydrotestosterone, one dihydrotestosterone molecule could interact with a receptor multiple times. So it depends upon the degradative enzymes actually destroying destroying or converting dihydrotestosterone into a less androgen stimulative hormone or an inert molecule that can basically allow it to not stimulate the androgen receptor. So if maybe everything here is normal, testosterone level is normal, all this is normal, but you can't degrade your testosterone and it keeps producing somehow, then you could potentially develop high levels of androgen, or present with high levels of androgen activity, such as acne. Now, there's a last aspect to this. I won't say this is the final aspect of hormone characteristics and sort of mechanisms of action, but there's hormone synergism, meaning that you could have one hormone that causes another hormone to increase in activity. So, and this is the case with insulin and testosterone. When you have insulin, a high level of insulin in the bloodstream, you increase androgen receptors, and this allows testosterone to interact with that. And I believe, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, insulin can actually stimulate the androgen receptor itself. So they're both sort of working together in order to stimulate the receptor. There's actually another aspect to this, which is, I can't think of the word, antagonistic synergism. So basically reverses synergism. So estrogen can actually somewhat interact with the androgen receptor, but because it's a weak interaction, it basically blocks the receptor. So because you now have blocking, the testosterone can't get there, and therefore you don't have an increase in activity, or at least one that you would have if the testosterone got to it. So it's actually an anti-synergism, if you will. So that basically sums up all the aspects of what goes on within your body, in your blood, and how it actually relates to the skin. But I don't think I actually talked about the fact that, hormones evolve. You go from having something like, you have hypothalamus, which you get a luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, and then from the luteinizing hormone interacting with the adrenal gland, you end up with DHEAs, which end up converting through some particular enzymes and eventually gives you testosterone. So maybe you have high levels of DHEAs, and your skin has the ability to metabolize those and create dihydrotestosterone, so your blood doesn't present with any sort of high levels of testosterone, but you have high levels of DHEAs, and that's causing your acne. Another thing, though, is that DHEAs can also stimulate the androgen receptor. That's another thing, is we think that the receptors are super selective, and the reality is there is a certain amount of selectivity to these hormones receptors, but there's also co-activation or co-synergism. So, I should say, co-activation, meaning one hormone can still stimulate another hormone's receptor, I should say. Okay, so we've talked a lot about that. I could go into coenzymes and stuff, but I won't do that. It's another aspect. In order for an enzyme to, I will. In order for an enzyme to actually activate, it may need a cofactor that basically allows it to activate. So that's something to be talked about with 5-alpha reductase. If you have a lot of 5-alpha reductase but not a lot of its cofactor, then maybe it doesn't work. So there you go. Hopefully that gives you a very broad stroke respect for how you can potentially view your skins and how you can potentially view hormones. So one thing to understand about science is that the diagrams that you're given are varied, even given even with the attempt of trying to give you the same information. So if we're trying to study something like how test or testosterone works, you see that there's an element of simplicity versus complexity, and it's also a matter of how specific you want to be. So here we have DHT coming into the cell, and then you have an androgen receptor binding to it and helping facilitate it into the nucleus. This then causes FOX1 expression and then you have different upregulations within the genome that cause lipid synthesis, which is what I would suggest is the prime cause of acne's, or I should say testosterone's role in developing acne. I would say that lipid synthesis is a fairly large component of how testosterone impacts acne development. Keratinization is important. I haven't yet grown respect for how testosterone is impacting the immune system, or for that matter, impacting how P. acne bacteria are influenced by DHT. So, because there isn't, unfortunately, enough study that seems to be revolved around that specific element. There is some, and there's certainly an impact, but it just seems to be more geared to the production of lipids and changes within keratinization. And those changes could arguably be because of the inflammation or some element like that, but I'm trying to distance myself from inflammation in the sense that trying to keep it only to immune specific or TH specific cells and their excretory byproducts, and not necessarily cells like keratin cells. Like keratin cells are differentiated from your immune cells, although there are certainly some elements that they are correlated with. But what we'll try and, again, go forward is understanding more about DHT and how it works. But basically, again, this shows you another example of testosterone coming in, what it's binding to, and then how it's being brought into the nucleus. And you can see that this is another enzyme that basically gets reformed so it can bring back in DHT. And so when this now DHT compound comes in with this androgen receptor for translation, it can be translated with several other components that have to come together, and then it finally comes out, and what's coming out is this whole lipid synthesis, and so a high production of lipids via this SREBP pathway that uses arachidonic acid in several steps and to form things like triglycerides, which make up sebaceous glands and well, basically every cell, but it is what's secreted from the sebaceous glands and in large quantities, and that's what the oil you appear in your skin, along with several other fatty acids, also upregulated as well. Now, this is another form, and one thing that we can try and generate some similarity to is this PI3 kinase and also a androgen here. So I would suggest that, see, this is the PI3 kinase, and this is another PI3 kinase, so they have some similarity in how they're going about showing a certain expression. Here you can see KT, there's KT, and androgen androgen, and basically coming into the androgen facilitator. This is the androgen facilitator because we're now inside the nucleus, as you can see, and then you get certain expressions, and then you also have the FOX1. Then here it actually doesn't show FOX1, but you get a gene expression here, and several other developments that it goes into less specific detail about here, because it's taking in so much into account beforehand, downstream, as they say, that it's not necessarily giving us enough information as far as upstream what that impact has specifically for us. But that's what I wanted to say. This is a rough idea on the nucleic level of how, molecular level of how testosterone works and how it's impacting our skin. Although it does seem that testosterone replacement can cause acne, it is dose dependent, meaning that very small doses won't do much to cause acne if injected intravenously. But if you inject superphysiological doses, that's when you'll actually have an effect. So you may say that bodybuilders will have this effect on top of the fact that they are drinking probably a lot of whey protein, among other things. It's difficult, and they're eating probably a lot of high glycemic foods to meet their desires, and also doing pre-workouts. It's difficult to say exactly what is the cause of maybe someone's like a bodybuilder's acne. However, testosterone replacement can cause acne when injected at superphysiological levels. It can also cause acne when just applied to the forehead. So testosterone can in fact have play an important role in the development of acne, but only when it's in a high degree of fluctuation. So the difficulty is when you're trying to analyze something like testosterone and saying it's the cause of acne, because if you're looking at an individual with high levels of acne, and then their testosterone is low, you may presume that testosterone is not the cause of acne. The reality is it can be a cause, but it is not the only cause, and it's this fluctuation within the hormones that is actually causing the most detrimental effect. And it's one of the main reasons why someone who is undergoing puberty, for someone who is well into adulthood, like 25 years of age, has a different level of acne development. Is also one of the reasons why women menstruating can also have high degrees of fluctuation and cause acne. And that's a result of not just specifically these testosterone or testosterone like steroids, but it's also a result of immune fluctuations, attributing everything to all the acne possibilities to something just like testosterone would be inaccurate. However, also using it as a means of therapy would be difficult, or a target therapy would be difficult. So say consuming a food specifically to reduce testosterone levels would not be something that would be advisable. And even in despite of the fact that you may have very high levels of testosterone, that shouldn't be used as a means of justification for taking something that would reduce your testosterone levels. Although, if you take, a testosterone booster, or if you're taking testosterone injections specifically, maybe as a supplement or as a as just a boost, again, you may need to alter your regime or reduce your testosterone injections, or under the correct advice of your medical doctor, you would stop it altogether. Now, so basically, you shouldn't have the side effects or symptoms if you're doing any sort of replacement therapy, if you're doing it correctly, and if you're doing it in a fashion that is advisable. But again, testosterone, although it does play an important role, it shouldn't be seen as what many seem to see it as, which is the reason for acne. Um, it is a part of puberty, and it plays a role. But just because someone has high levels of testosterone doesn't necessarily mean that they're more susceptible to acne, even. So the susceptibility to acne is something that we're really interested in. How easily someone gets acne versus how easily someone doesn't get acne. So what allows someone to eat very high glycemic foods, to take a testosterone booster, to drink dairy daily that isn't pasteurized, or I should say isn't culture grown or anything like that, isn't yogurt, and they just drink it straight up. Has a whole lot of IGF-1 in it. What allows them to do that resistance to get acne, is very intriguing, and it's something that's one of the most difficult things to pinpoint. We can only really right now assess the correlative factors, and then once we understand the factors that can best present or simulate acne, we can then see whether or not, when pressed with a scenario, who does and who does not get acne, and then analyze genomes, among other things. That's the question that everyone seems to want. What makes them unique? What makes them incapable of getting acne? And then how can I acquire that ability? So now that we've talked about hormones, we can get into the fun topic of age and acne. So there's certainly correlations that have developed between age and acne, the most predominant being that puberty is associated with acne. The question becomes why, and why in older ages do you have a reduction in the susceptibility, or why does the susceptibility why do you not acquire the susceptibility in certain individuals, namely women, and also in younger years, how come you don't have that sort of susceptibility to develop acne then? And this has many things, and there's many things that actually evolve. Everyone says, oh, your testosterone goes up and that causes acne and development in puberty. And the reality is that it's much more than that, because if you actually look at it, and I believe we will reference this again, is that your levels of testosterone are not the highest during puberty. They're the highest after puberty. So it's not necessarily the testosterone elevation that's causing the acne. It's the hormone fluctuations and potentially the stress it causes, along with other developing processes. So what are those other developing processes? Immune changes, changes in hair growth via follicular stimulating hormone, immune development. When you're really young, you only actually have M antibodies, but when you progress in age, after your mother has also given you antibodies, IgA and IgG, potentially among others, to you, you begin to produce your own different types of antibodies. Now, there's also adrenal output. When you're really young, you don't have a whole lot of adrenal output from your adrenal glands. And by adrenal output, I mean hormone synthesis via your adrenal glands. Now, there's also what's called the pituitary gland, which is the widely regarded as the master hormone regulator for its ability to secrete luteinizing hormone and IGF-1, and IGF-1's influence on that. We talked about the hormone fluctuations, and there's also, like I talked about earlier, is intracellular enzymes. So there's enzymes that are in sort of the matrix of the skin. So all the areas in between the skin, and there's also enzymes within the cytosol, within the actual cell, and that's actually where dihydrotestosterone is active. That's where it's an intercellular androgen receptor that actually initiates its activity, but we'll talk about that, I think, later. So those are changed, so your intracellular enzymes are changed along again with the receptors and such. Now another very interesting aspect is that pubescence actually causes insulin resistance. So I'm not necessarily sure if it's in all individuals. I can't imagine that it's in every single individual as a pathological standpoint. It's not necessarily even pathological, it's just how we've evolved. Some speculate because this insulin resistance is actually not a true resistance. What it does is that it allows the body to ask to grow. So basically, the insulin is still stimulating the IGF-1 receptor, or the insulin receptors, but they're not being either broken down. The insulin is neither being broken down, or it's or the pancreas is hyper secreting this insulin to a glycemic stimulus, because that insulin helps the pubescent individual grow, and as a result, that also means that for an individual who's in puberty, that they're more susceptible to acne because they're more susceptible to hyperinsulin secretion because they're going through a growth phase. So, and now we're going to talk about each age's aspect of acne, how acne can develop in each different age group and why it does, and also potentially why there might be some resistances in the development of acne within these age groups. So this image speaks to a point that I made earlier, which is cross-reactivity of receptors, and also co-stimulation of receptors. So you have insulin, IGF-1, corticotropin-releasing hormone, all these different chemicals. Each are activating their unique receptor. Now, although their activation of these receptors results in a variety of different things, one of the things that all of these chemicals have in common is that they all seem to stimulate PI3 kinase, and this eventually ends up having an influence on FOXO1 expression, and that ends up causing cell proliferation, lipogenesis, inflammation through a variety of means listed here, and P. acne growth. So as a result, these all can, in theory, have a functional role in acne development. The other thing to keep in mind is that FOXO1 is not the only gene that's related to acne, and so all these other chemicals could be doing something else. However, it is certainly a very important one because, as studies have shown, it's where Accutane seems to have a dominant effect on. But again, this hopefully just gives you context for understanding how hormones interact, and ultimately gives you the ability to discuss with your physician the best treatment for you, and hopefully gives you the tools necessary for you to research a cure, just like I am. So that should cover this topic. Baby acne. Why babies have acne? They don't have testosterone, right? They don't have enlarged pores. These kids are just out of the womb. They're innocent. They're not going through puberty. Why do these kids have acne? One idea is that their adrenal glands, from maybe stress, maybe they're not being fed right, something's causing stress within them, and they actually somehow have got extensive adrenal gland output, which is the source of their androgen levels that end up resulting in acne. Another one is that maternal hormones passed through breast milk are causing an elevation in testosterone within the child. So because the breast milk has a high level of testosterone, it causes high levels of testosterone within the child. Another one is that these kids are very, very young, and they're like sponges. So they have a high gut permeability, because ideally nature has evolved, I believe, in a sense, to accept milk, because that's what the child is going to be eating, and it wants as much milk as possible. So it's opened all the doors. Give me all the what mom's got, in a sense, and don't miss out on any potential good aspect, any potential probiotic capacity that my mom's milk has. Another one is that maybe there's a poor B cell activation, because they only have IgM. One may say, well, that's great. If they don't have B cell activity, then they can't interact with, or they can't, hyper destroy P. acne. But the end result is that maybe they can't destroy it at all, and then that's what's causing the issue. As again, you see this yin and yang, too much versus too little, and what that has an effect on the skin. So another one is that these kids are fresh out the womb, and they're growing pretty quickly, and so you have this really rapid growth. And remember, your bones aren't the only thing you're growing. Your skin's also growing, and maybe the body doesn't have a great ability at selectively growing just one particular part of the skin, and ends up sort of cross growing the skin that's in the sebaceous gland, and you end up with a plug and baby acne. There's a variety of other skin conditions that are associated with babies, such as skull cap and chicken skin. I'm not too sure if we talked about all those, but those also occur for somewhat similar reasons, potentially, along with the ones that we have not spoke about. Pre-adolescent acne, 7 to 11 years old. About 47% of kids at this age group actually end up with acne. Usually it's not that severe, and it may even come and go, but it does increase the risk, or at least be a predictor of severe acne in puberty, so or during pubescent age, I should say. So if you have a kid who has acne, you may need to get yourself ready for a child that has pubescent acne, and maybe need to try and start looking into these things and being retroactive. Although, if you've gotten to this point, you've done a lot of work already. Now, what sort of fits this whole age group under one wing is adrenal awakening. However, there's another aspect to this, which is this age group is really starting to take on a diet that is more similar to a westernized lifestyle, and they're not necessarily eating baby food and stuff anymore. They've begun the process aspect of our food system, and also the convenient aspect, I should say, the convenient aspect of our food system, and as a result, their skin may be suffering from it. So here we go, pubescence in acne. Everyone knows about this one. So you have about 90% of people, if not almost everyone, gets acne around this age. It increases, so pubescence increases total testosterone and free testosterone, along with potentially, like I've alluded to earlier, causes insulin, a sort of pubescent insulin resistance. And again, there's immune and hormone fluctuations. But the big aspect about this for me is that your hormone levels are not peaked at pubescence. They're peaked around 25 or so. And for me, that means that there's something else going on, and I believe it's related to the hormone fluctuations. It's because things are changing, and they're changing so rapidly that your body is just having a tough time moving at that pace. Things are, and also all the different stresses that go on usually can exacerbate these fluctuations and cause their own mechanism of acne development. So I believe that pubescent acne is a product of the hormone fluctuations more than it is a product of the total level of, let's say, testosterone, or total level of certain androgen stimulating or otherwise hormones becoming elevated. I mean, if you try and look for a particular hormone that is elevated at a particular time of pubescence that is higher than, say, when it is at 25, you have a difficult time finding that. At least I did. So that's my perspective on pubescent acne and what its characteristics are and causes. Adult acne. So it's fairly prevalent, and it covers everyone from 19 to above, basically. About 50% of women have acne in their 30s. 12% of women in their 40s have acne. 40% of males in their 30s have acne, and 3% of males in their 40s have acne. As you can see, there's a large difference when you're in your 40s compared to women and males. And a pretty significant difference between males and women, again, in their 30s. About 73% of individuals who do have acne, especially for extended durations, such as into adulthood, have scarring. So it's something to be considered if you're an adult who has had persistent acne, that you're going to be at an increased risk of scarring, potentially because of your age, but also just because of the off chance that the more pimples that you get, the more chance that something's going to occur where you're going to end up with a scar. We're going to be talking about the pathology of scarring shortly, but what we're going to actually talk about more details in is what causes adult acne, and which can still relate to pubescent acne, but these are more pronounced in adult acne because you don't have that natural susceptibility that puberty gives you. So one of the stronger related causes is stress. So stress is going to have a big impact on the incidence of adult acne. Another one that's much less is cigarette smoking. Some studies suggest it isn't a causative role, and some others suggest that it is. It really depends upon who you speak to and the study that you're looking at. However, I think it's safe to assume that smoking is both unhealthy and also safer to assume that quitting smoking would be more beneficial than not. I have seen on certain forums suggesting that I quit cigarettes and now I broke out like crazy. Well, what happens when you quit cigarettes? You get really stressed out at first until you're basically can come down off of having your nick fit. So any sort of withdrawal effect that you get from ceasing cigarette smoke that would cause acne would likely be a result of the stress. Obesity and being underweight. This is particular for women because it can cause something called polycystic ovarian syndrome, which we'll talk about in a bit. As you can see that there's pretty extensive differences within the women and the males in their 40s and in their 30s. This difference may be able to be attributed to primarily hormonal fluctuations that increase the susceptibility to acne. There's one interesting variant that occurs with adult acne, and that is there's a moderate reduction in lipids compared to pubescent acne, or pubescent acne, I should say, but it still holds the same amount of squalene, roughly, as far as the composition is concerned. And the squalene, as I've suggested, is a strong component of acne development, and so basically you still have the susceptibility because of the squalene in the sebum. So there's one question a lot of people don't seem to ask within regards to acne that I think would help give people some perspective, and that is, when is acne usually the worst? It's usually the worst in women from 14 to 17 years old, and the worst for men at 16 to 19 years old. So if you're a 12-year-old woman, you may be considering, or girl if you will, you may be considering, oh, I hate my acne, I want it to go away. However, you should sort of mentally prepare yourself that it is likely to get worse before it gets better. However, your treatments that you're using are hopefully sort of nipping it in the bud, meaning that it is likely to peak here, but if you're starting to treat beforehand, you may actually not have the severity that you would have otherwise. And the same goes for men. And this also speaks to some hope. If you're a 17 or 18-year-old woman, then you can sort of expect to see a reduction in your severity of acne. And like I've talked about before, though, with regards to age and acne, it's not to say that the severity skews are individual specific, meaning that some people may have like almost no acne when in their high school, and then it peaks at 20, 25 years old in that group. So this is just speaking to the most large prognosis for an individual with acne and how it basically evolves. And this graph here is just showcasing that basically it isn't direct data, but it is general trends of certain chemicals that we associate with puberty and aging. And we'll notice when we're talking about acne, we're going to be talking about testosterone and adrenal androgens. And the thing is that they don't necessarily peak right when you would expect acne to be at its worst. We're talking here about, say, 25 or so. Now, and for testosterone, it's elevated for a considerable period of time before it ever reaches its lowest point, meaning that this puberty, the thing that's associated strongly with acne, may be associated with acne because of fluctuations within the hormones rather than a specific elevation or decrease. There's also potential for ratio distributions, like I've talked about before, where you have sort of co-activation of a androgen receptor, and therefore they don't actually maybe activate less or activate more. So I just want to give that some understanding, is that it's not to say that someone has absurdly high testosterone levels when you're in puberty and that's why you have acne. It's not that simple. It's potentially because of these fluctuations, and again the ratios and the number of other things that we've talked about. And so hopefully when I talk about treatments, because I will talk about treatments because all I'm giving you is a bunch of problems so far, you'll be able to best treat yourself with the assistance of your healthcare practitioner.